This blower has a very big problem even after we tried to repair it. However, it seemed to have a different agenda and we weren't able to get it fixed. The problem now is that the issue it has goes a bit further than any reasonable person should have to deal with. Now, I have been told that I'm pretty unreasonable sometimes, so I guess that means I'm going to have to go even further to try and figure out what's wrong with this blower so that we can get it fixed. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Weedeater brand leaf blower, and the problem is that even after servicing the carb, it still won't start. Now, the original plan for this blower was to of course sell it, but if I spend too much time on it, I am a bit worried that I won't get my time and more importantly my money back out of it. Now, I'm going to try and repair this leaf blower, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things aren't working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it. I'd be glad to answer your questions. If you missed the last video on this blower, we ended up cleaning and servicing the carb and also replaced the fuel lines in a very badly clogged fuel filter. So after all that hard work, it still refused to start and run the way it's supposed to. I'll try and start it up and maybe you can figure out what's going on with it. Now, you have to keep in mind that you cannot keep pulling on the rope while it's fully choked, otherwise you could flood the engine. So as you can see and hear, it's not wanting to start, but at least it's trying to, which is better than nothing, I guess. So to rule out that the carb is an issue, I did order a new carb to replace the one we just serviced. Now, if you're not comfortable with cleaning and servicing a carb, then I would always recommend that you just replace the carb in the first place. I do have to admit that getting to the carb and taking it off on this particular blower is one of the easiest ones I've ever worked on. All you have to do is remove the filter cover and the filter, disconnect the fuel lines, and then remove the two long bolts that hold the carb to the engine, and it comes right off. Now, if you want to, you can just remove the filter line, leaving the return line still connected, and then pump out all the fuel from the carb. What this will do is empty out all the fuel that's inside the carb. That way when you open it to service it, there won't be a huge mess to worry about. After that, I'll then install the brand new carb onto the engine, and then we'll test to see if we still have the same starting issue. And if we still can't get the engine started, it means that the problem has to be with the engine and not the carb. Now, it's not going to tell us exactly what's wrong with the engine, but since the fuel lines were also changed out, it would certainly get us closer to what the real issue might be. Unfortunately, this is a bit of foreshadowing, but then again, we can't all be lucky when working on something like this. I don't know if you heard that, but I just heard a light backfire through the carb, which is kind of interesting to know. So what did we just learn from that test start? Well, it would seem that it doesn't matter if the carb is brand new or not because it still didn't start. That means there must be something wrong with the engine instead, and unfortunately, this means we've got to take the entire blower apart just to get to it. Now, this has to be one of the biggest gripes I have with this blower design, where the impeller is located on the bottom of the engine. On this design, they felt it was needed to cover the entire engine with plastic to protect the user, but it makes working on it really tough, as you can tell. The only saving grace on this entire thing is that it's really easy to take apart, just so long as you have a power tool to help out. Otherwise, your hand and forearm are going to get really tired after taking off about 25 screws, not including several nuts. I would also recommend that you have a way to keep all the fasteners organized after you take them off the engine, because if you've never done this before, you can get lost and forget which one goes where. You can either use a magnetic bowl or a strip, which is what I like to use, but you can also use a piece of cardboard with holes in it and just push the fasteners into it. The nuts will be a bit tougher to deal with, but in the past, I've just used a piece of wire through the cardboard to hold them. The last part that's keeping us from taking the plastic completely off the engine is the spark plug, but once that's gone, we should be able to see the engine. Now, the last cover I just took off is also the part that seals against the back of the engine with a large O-ring. Now, if this O-ring should be damaged in some way, it could cause a massive air leak in the engine, which for a two-stroke will cause it to be impossible to start. There's just one problem. This O-ring is in great condition, so I don't think this is the issue we're having. Now, there are other locations on the engine where there could be an air leak, so when we get to them, I'll be sure to point them out. So with the ignition coil out of the way, we can get a better look at the front seal on the engine. So this would be another location where we could have an intake leak, but if there was a leak here, we'd see evidence of it in the way of dirt and oil, but there's none here, so we'll have to keep looking elsewhere. The other reason why I had to remove the coil was so that I could take off the muffler, which is held in place by 2 springs. I want to inspect the muffler for any issues along with the exhaust port for any carbon buildup that might be blocking airflow from the engine. So there is a small amount of carbon in the exhaust port, but it's not bad enough to have an effect on the engine. Also, while I'm here, we can also inspect the wear on the piston ring because if it's too worn out, it could mean there wouldn't be enough compression from the engine. So there's definitely some wear on the piston ring, but it's not that bad. However, I should also see the piston ring moving somewhat while I turn the engine back and forth. But it's not doing that, which can only mean the piston ring must be stuck in the landing, which will hamper its ability to seal against the cylinder. That would then reduce the engine's ability to compress the air and fuel and might be the reason why it's acting the way that it is. That means we'll have to take the cylinder off the block so that we can inspect the piston ring's condition, which I have to say doesn't sound tough, but it's certainly not fun either. I'm also going to do something that a lot of the viewers aren't going to like, which is to make another exhaust opening in the muffler. The reason I'm doing this is to try and help it breathe since there's no serviceable spark arrestor screen on this muffler. Now in hindsight, I should have made the opening on the other side of the pinch seam, but it's still going to help out somewhat. Next, I'm going to remove the 2 bolts that hold the cylinder to the block, and if you hadn't guessed it, this would be the other location for a possible intake leak. However, as you just saw, the bolts were not loose, and the chances of the base gasket breaking without the bolts being loose is highly unlikely. After the bolts are finally gone, we can then separate the block and the cylinder and expose that tiny piston and its stuck ring. And of course, since this is a very cheap engine, we can take the connecting rod off the crank by just sliding it off. So as you can see, the top of the piston is covered with carbon, which is to be expected, but that means there's a good chance that carbon might extend down to the ring landing, which it has. And that carbon is now keeping the piston ring in place instead of it making contact with the cylinder wall. Now, strangely enough, only part of the ring is free while the majority of it is stuck, but that's actually a good thing. With part of it free, it'll make working it loose just a bit easier. However, you'll need to be extremely cautious when doing this. Now, there are other ways to free the ring, such as using a solvent that'll break up the carbon or using some heat, but if you don't have those on hand, nothing beats using gentle persuasion. Just remember to take your time and work at it slowly, otherwise the ring will break and you'll need to buy a new one, which is about impossible to get because these are technically discontinued. Now, once the ring is out of the landing, you'll need to clean the carbon out from that area along with any other carbon that you can find. Now, it's up to you how you choose to remove the carbon, but like before, take your time and go slowly, otherwise you could damage something. And that's because if you should damage the piston, well, you're going to find out that it's just as tough to replace as the ring. After removing as much carbon from the piston and the ring, I think it's time to put this engine back together and see if this is going to get this engine to start and run again. Now, there's really no good way to explain how to carefully install the ring back onto the piston other than to not expand it too much because I'm pretty sure you know what could happen to it. After that's done, I'll then spray a thin lubricant onto the side of the piston, that way it won't be a dry start. So the next part is yet again another place where you have to be extremely careful when installing the piston into the cylinder. Now, if you try and force the piston into the cylinder without compressing the ring with your fingers, you could end up breaking the piston ring. So now that most of the hard work and the frustrating part of this entire repair is finally done, we can now reassemble the engine, which in comparison seems a bit tame to what we just did. Now, before I installed the cylinder, I did check that the base gasket was not broken on the block and was still sitting right where it needed to be. Now, strangely enough, even though certain parts of this engine are discontinued, they still sell the gasket kit for it. So if you need to replace this gasket, well, you're in luck. So when replacing the ignition coil on this engine, I like to use a standard business card to set the air gap for the flywheel. Now, there are other methods to do this, but this by far is the easiest and quickest way I know, so that's why I use it. Now, the way the muffler is attached to the engine has to be the cheapest way possible, but that pretty much falls along the price point for this blower, which is the cheaper the better. Now, after struggling for minutes with these impossibly stiff springs, I was finally able to get them installed onto the muffler. That means the rest of the assembly is pretty much installing the plastics and a whole mess of screws and some nuts. Now, while I finish up the installation, I do want to talk about these tiny blowers and the reason why they even exist in the market in the first place. Now, not everyone needs a really good leaf blower because, let's face it, that typically means a big engine, a lot of weight, and an even bigger price tag, so this is the exact opposite of that. Now, if you were going to buy something like this, it was for blowing the leaves off your front porch or blowing out your garage, but most times you were just going to use it to blow the grass clippings around, which doesn't need a lot of power. The one thing you aren't going to do is use this on the leaves on your front yard because if you did, it was going to take you all day to get the job done. That means if you have a small job to do and a small budget, all you needed was a small blower, which certainly describes this blower perfectly. Now, I should have waited to install the spark plug, and that's because I still need to do a compression test to find out what the reading is since we just freed up that piston ring. So I had to do that test several times to get a decent reading, and that's because it wasn't very good. So as you can see, the best I got was a very disappointing 110 psi, which although is low, should be more than enough for the engine to start and run now. Now, it didn't even try and start, which is not a good sign. Hopefully it'll do something when I try that again at half choke. Well, that was not what I was hoping to see happen. It didn't even try and start, but at least it still backfired like it did before. There should be more than enough compression from the engine, and I already showed that the carb was not an issue. That means there must still be something wrong with the engine. Now, I'm almost out of ideas on this one, so this is when I have to really consider my options, otherwise this might be a lost cause. So my question is, what do you think the problem might be with this engine? Do you think it's a leaking seal, or do you think it's something else? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.